Hello, my little historians, and welcome to Lesson 823, American Reaction to British Taxation. So one more time, you guys are all in 8th grade. This is Unit 2, the American Revolution, specifically Lesson 3, how the Americans reacted to British actions. And that includes both things that they did as well as laws that they passed. So we begin with our bell ringer. As always, I just need you guys to be filling in the blanks. Refer back to your previous notes. It should be fairly straightforward. Moving on. We're going to begin with a quick reference to something called the Snowball Effect. And as you guys know, I'm a big fan of Donald Duck, so let's go with the Donald Duck cartoon. So here we go. He's got a snowball, goes down the hill, and as it goes down the hill, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until finally there you go. So the snowball effect. The idea is that you start out with something very, very small. This very small snowball that Chip is throwing down the hill. And this very small snowball gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it finally gets to Donald, in which case it knocks him out the back of his cabin. So why am I bringing up the snowball effect? Because at this point, we are talking about how Americans reacted to British taxation. So if you remember from our previous lesson, the British passed a series of taxes. We'll go into that in just a little bit. But your objective for today is that students will be able to describe how American colonists reacted to British actions, including the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the First Continental Congress. So we're going to be covering all of those topics in the course of today's lesson. So, the vocabulary you will need to know for this lesson. An act is a law. So when we hear the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, what we are talking about are laws. The Stamp Act is a law about stamps. The Sugar Act is a law about sugar. The Intolerable Acts, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, these are a bunch of acts, a bunch of laws that people thought were unfair. Civil disobedience is specifically a form of protest. More specifically, it is a refusal to obey the law. And this is a different kind of protest than we've been talking about before. Before we talked about smuggling, which is just straight up breaking the law. We talked about boycotts, which is refusing to buy something, but that's not really breaking the law. Civil disobedience is very much like, for instance, what Dr. King did. You know, he and his followers would pointedly disobey the law. They would walk into segregated lunch counters, sit down, and try to place an order. They were breaking the law. They thought the law was wrong, and they were very publicly saying, I think this law is wrong, I refuse to obey it. So that's civil disobedience. Next, we're going to talk about propaganda. Propaganda is one-sided media. So the fact of the matter is, anytime anybody does anything, there are two sides to the equation. So propaganda is just listening to one person. So if my daughters come in and they are arguing with each other, I say, okay, Ellie, what happened? Ellie tells her side of the story, and then I don't listen to Evie. That's not fair. But propaganda is one way that you can get people to come around to your side. So there's that. And then lastly, we need to know what quarter means. In this case, quarter means to house someone. So for all of you guys who play Call of Duty, for instance, you keep hearing about headquarters. That's where the head of the army quarters. That's where the generals have a house, basically. So that's what quartering means, and we'll come back to that in just one moment. Moving on. We're going to introduce you to a group of guys called the Sons of Liberty. So the Sons of Liberty, these were people who opposed these British taxes. So all of these taxes that came down from Parliament, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, the Sons of Liberty were the ones who were saying, hey guys, this is not fair, we should fight back. And how did they fight back? Well, we previously mentioned they had protests, they had boycotts, they had smuggling. The Sons of Liberty were the guys who were on point with this. These are the guys who are saying, hey, we need to be more active about what's going on in our lives. We need to do something about this if we want to see things change. So that's what the Sons of Liberty are doing. One of the most important things you need to know about them is that their leader was a man named Samuel Adams. No, not the beer. The guy was named Samuel Adams. That's what his name was. Moving on. We have the Boston Massacre of 1770. So we previously talked about a couple of acts of Parliament, a couple of laws, a couple of taxes that they passed. And now let's talk about something that really shook America. So the Boston Massacre happened when British soldiers fired into a crowd of rowdy colonists. So a bunch of colonists were making fun of them, throwing snowballs. Some of those snowballs had rocks in them. And then eventually these British soldiers fired on them. And what's important is that even though they had like clubs, like baseball bat type things, even though they had snowballs with rocks in them, they were for the most part unarmed. So what we have here is a group of soldiers firing on a group of people who are completely unarmed. And I think we all can agree that is a bad situation. Soldiers are there to protect the colonists, and instead they're firing on them. 6 colonists were killed in the Boston Massacre. One of those people who was killed was this guy, a guy named Crispus Attucks. He was the first man to die for American liberty. A lot of people considered him to be the first hero, the first guy who laid down his life for the sake of American liberty. And I don't know if you guys can tell by looking at this picture, but he was African American. He was a freed slave. And he was involved in this, scuffle with these British soldiers, and he wound up getting killed. So what happened was all of these soldiers were tried for murder, and all of them were let go. A couple of them had very, very mild punishments, but for the most part, they were all let go. And a lot of people got very upset about this. And the result was that this became a propaganda symbol. So if you guys remember, there's a guy named Paul Revere, and he made this engraving, this very specific one, that shows a bunch of soldiers firing into a crowd. All these guys are dying all over the place. This is a form of propaganda. This is a form of the country saying, look at how evil the British are. Look at what monsters they are. Now, is there another side to the story? I mean, yeah, these guys went on trial in Boston, and a Boston jury found them not guilty. So there's another side to this. But what Americans did was to say, look at all of the evil things that are going on with British. We don't like them in the first place, and now look what they do. So this is a very important development, because now we're not even trying to think about, okay, but what is the king trying to do? Now it's just, shut it down. We cannot stand this. So moving on, let's do a quick review of all of the various taxes that we had previously talked about. So if you recall, Parliament and the King, the British government and the British King, passed the Sugar Act, a tax on sugar and molasses and rum. And in response, the American colonists kept saying, no taxation without representation. You can tax us, but we want a voice in our government. What the British King, the British Parliament heard was, oh, no taxation? Okay, we'll get rid of that, problem solved, right? No. They want a voice in the British government. So the British government hits them with another tax, the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on paper products. Playing cards, newspapers, just regular paper, paper official documents like birth certificates, death certificates, marriage license, all that kind of stuff. You have to pay that. You have to buy the stamp, and the stamp is a tax. And one more time, the colonists say, no taxation without representation. We want a voice in the government. And the government says, oh, no taxation? Okay, we'll get rid of the Stamp Act and everything will be fine, right? No. One more time. The Townshend Acts. more taxes. These taxes are on lead and glass and paint and paper and tea. And all of these taxes are coming down on the colonists. And the colonists are saying, no taxation without representation. We are fine paying the taxes. Just give us a voice in the government. And the British government says, okay, we'll get rid of the taxation. No taxation. That's what you want, right? And we'll hit you with the Tea Act. So in this case, once again, we'll just tax tea. So less taxation. Problem solved, right? I'm sure you guys are getting very annoyed with the way I'm doing this. Imagine how the colonists were feeling. So at this point, the colonists are like, okay, you know what? That's it. We're done. So after the Tea Act, the Sons of Liberty start what is called the Boston Tea Party of 1773. So Parliament passes the Tea Act, and the Sons of Liberty, these guys are in charge. They create the Boston Tea Party. They dress up like natives because natives were symbols of America. And like I was saying in the previous lesson, every single time Parliament ignored the colonists, they were basically saying, you're not British, you're Americans. This law only applies to you Americans. And so the end result is that these colonists started thinking, okay, maybe we're not British, maybe we are Americans. So as a symbol of America, they dressed up as natives, the people who were already here. And they walked onto this ship, and they broke into these cases, and they dumped shiploads of tea into Boston Harbor. Literal shiploads. They stormed onto these ships, broke open these cases of tea, and dumped them into the harbor. I would like to remind you, a harbor is a safe place to park your ships. So these ships came into Boston Harbor because they were going to be safe. They came into the town of Boston, and then these guys dumped all of the tea into Boston Harbor. So this is one of those examples of what we call civil disobedience. These guys are not just saying, no, we're not going to do that. They're saying, we hate this so very much that we would rather dump the tea in the harbor than just not buy it. Are you getting the message now? Yes. Parliament got the message, and Parliament was furious. So furious, in fact, that they passed what are called the Intolerable Acts. If you don't know what intolerable means, stop! Break it down! Intolerable. Take off the in, take off the able. What is the root of intolerable? Tolerate. So when they say intolerate, they mean you cannot tolerate this. You are unable to tolerate this. This is so incredibly unfair, I can't even handle it. So that's what we mean when we refer to the intolerable acts. There were a bunch of them. There were about 4 of them that came out at the time. And the gist of these were, first of all, the whole point of this was that they were trying to punish the colonies for the Boston Tea Party. This was more than just, hey, we're passing another tax because we have to pay the debts. No, this was a, you guys are going to pay, literally and figuratively. So one more time, this was specifically meant to punish the colonies. Like I said, 4 main laws. One of them said that all people who had to stand trial stood trial in England. And this is really frustrating for a couple of reasons. First of all, England is 2,000 miles away. It takes 2 months to get to England on a ship. So if you are arrested and they put you on a boat immediately and you go to England, you stand trial as soon as you get there and they find you innocent, it's going to be 4 months before you come back home. So that's one thing. Another thing that you got to keep in mind is that British soldiers killed American colonists. They stood trial where the crime was committed. And a Boston jury said these guys should go free. But now Britain is saying, no, we can't trust these local juries. We have to trust English juries. Seriously? You think we don't know how to administer justice? Who do you think you are? So that's one thing. The next law closed Boston Harbor. So one more time, harbor, safe place to park a ship. Like we said in the 812 lesson about the 13 colonies, the New England colonies, they had all these great harbors. Boston Harbor was one of these. It's a safe place to park your ship. So they had a lot of shipping businesses. They had a lot of ocean businesses based in Boston Harbor. Fishing, shipping, whaling, all of this stuff. And now the British have said, okay, this harbor is closed. So that means every fisherman lost their job. Every whaler lost their job. Every merchant who was trying to ship stuff lost his job. Every shipbuilder lost his job. So all of this is seriously punishing Boston. And this is why, when you have this picture, this is talking about the Bostonians in distress. So as you can see, these Bostonians are kind of in prison because, among other things, it also passed something called the Quartering Act. And we're going to get to that in the next slide. But then lastly, there was a law that closed the Massachusetts colonial government. And I want you guys to think about that. What do you remember about the Mayflower Compact? They wrote their system of government before they even got off the ship. Before they found shelter, before they built a fire, before they found fresh water, they said we need a government first. Government was incredibly important to people in Massachusetts, and the British government just said, okay, you guys are not allowed to take care of yourselves. We are going to tell you what to do. So one more time, all of these laws, all of these acts were meant to punish the colonies. And so the colonies called them intolerable, unbearable laws. Even in Britain, they called them coercive, the coercive acts. And when you coerce somebody, you're basically blackmailing them or using force. So this was pretty rough, especially when it comes to the specifics of, the Quartering Act. Because the Quartering Act meant that the American colonists had to house British soldiers. They had to put them up in their house, like a guest. Except, first of all, a British soldier would come knock on your door and say, we're going to live here. 1, 2, 9, don't know how many, but they're going to knock on your door and say, we're going to live here. For free. You're not going to get it paid at all. I would also like to remind you guys, these soldiers would demand the best room in the house. So that means, think about this. If there are only 2 rooms in the house, then that means that mom and dad have to share the room with the kids, and the soldiers get the best room in the house. Still not done yet, though. You also have to feed these soldiers for free. And this is not just, okay, they get a place at the table when it's dinner time. This is, you have to feed them when they want to be fed. You want to feed them as much as they want to be fed. And you don't get paid for it. So one more time, if these soldiers stagger in drunk at 3 o'clock in the morning and they say, hey, wake up, we're hungry, it's dinner time. And you have to make them as much food as they want at 3 o'clock in the morning. So there's that. Then, the other issue is, you have to wash their clothes for them. They don't have to wash their own clothes, so you're going to have to do it for them. Sucks, doesn't it? Because basically, having a guest in your house is kind of like extra chores for everybody, and these guys are sticking around for we don't know how long. Also, you have to clean up after them. So if they track mud into the house, you have to clean it off. I would also like to remind you guys, it was so absolutely filthy back then. Keep in mind, they didn't have cars, they had horses. And when you have horses, they're going to poop all over the place. So, hopefully, what these soldiers are tracking into the house is mud. Might not be, though. Still not done yet. You also have to polish their boots. So this is a picture of a young man in South Carolina. His name is Andrew Jackson. So this British officer said, "Hey, you need to polish my boots." And Andrew Jackson said, "No, I'm not going to do that." So the soldier took out his sword and beat him because he wouldn't polish his boots. And my personal favorite, I saved the worst for last. Keep in mind, back then, they didn't have indoor plumbing. They didn't have running water in the house. So if you wanted a drink of water, you had to go to the well and get some. If you wanted to cook with some water, you had to go to the well and get some. If you want to wash your face, you got to go to the well and get some water. But the other thing is that what else uses running water in your house? The kitchen sink, the bathroom sink, the bathtub, the toilet. They didn't have toilets back then. They had something called a chamber pot. It was basically a bucket. So if a soldier knocked on your house's door, and said, "We're going to live here," you also had to empty their bucket, their toilet bucket. So, one more time. Can you guys understand why the Americans may have been getting more than a little frustrated at all of these? I hope so. So all of these things are going on, and I'd like to remind you guys, the entire point of the Intolerable Acts is that they were punishing the colonies. They were punishing the colonies because of the Boston Tea Party. And what was the Boston Tea Party again? Oh, wait, it was a protest? So here is just a protest saying, "Hey, we don't like this law." And now the British government is punishing the colonies. This is not just a, "Hey, we don't like this law, so, you have to, pay back the amount that you owe." It's, "We are closing your port, so you don't have any jobs. We are punishing you guys by giving you soldiers who have to live in your homes. We are closing your government, the government that you've had since before you got here. We are going to force you guys to stand trials over in Britain." So 2-month journey there, 2-month journey back, because apparently we can't trust you when it comes to being fair in a courtroom. Now, when all of this was going on, the rest of the colonies were like, "Dude, no, this is not okay. We got to do something about this." And so they started up what was called the First Continental Congress. Congress, that means to come together. And continental means on the continent. So they said, "Okay, we're going to come together and we got to talk about this." So the whole point of this was that they were trying to respond to the Intolerable Acts. They were like, "This is not okay. How do we respond? We have to respond to the Intolerable Acts. How do we do that?" So representatives from almost all of the colonies came together and they were like, we've got to organize a response to the Intolerable Acts. And how did they respond in the past? Well, they organized a boycott, because boycotts are very effective. If you want somebody to change, take money away from them. That's probably going to make them change. But one of the things that they also did was to write a strongly worded letter. They wrote a letter to the king saying, "Look, can everybody please just take a step back, calm down, and we can figure this whole thing out. We don't need to make this worse. This snowball is rolling down the hill. We don't want it to knock Donald Duck out the back of his cabin. Let's stop this snowball before it gets any bigger and out of control." So that's the letter that they sent off to the king saying, "Hey, let's all hit the brakes and calm down." But then they also said, if this doesn't work, let's get ready to meet again in case we have to step things up a notch. And that's very important because of what happens with our next lesson. So, at this point, I'd like you guys to go ahead and take care of this formative assessment. What we are looking at is cause and effect. So, the French and Indian War was the cause. What was the effect, the immediate effect of the French and Indian War? Something caused the colonists to boycott taxes. And then the Boston Massacre caused something else. So I'd like you guys to go ahead and fill that out. I'll take a look at that as soon as you've turned it in. And then lastly, your independent work is going to be more of this timeline that we had started yesterday. So just like we said before, we've got the Boston Tea Party, we've got the Boston Massacre, the Quartering Act, and the Intolerable Acts. So what I want you guys to do is put these in chronological order. So that's the order in which they happen. You can go back through your notes and find these. I need to see the year. I need to see a description of what it was. And then if you could copy and paste a picture out of Google Images, that would be great. So the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the Quartering Act, and the Intolerable Acts. Please make certain that you get all of those taken care of with this set of the timeline. Please make certain that you include the years. So lastly, we want to take a look at what we learned. What is the takeaway that we need to understand from this lesson? So one more time, all of these American colonists, they thought of themselves as British citizens who had rights, just like any other British citizen. But they started these protests because they felt like Parliament wasn't respecting their rights. We're British citizens. We have a right to representation, don't we? And Parliament just kept ignoring them and passing all these taxes over and over and over again. So we had protests, we had boycotts, and then we had civil disobedience. And once that happens, Parliament overreacts. Everybody is like, whoa, Parliament, look, we understand that these guys did something that you didn't like, but calm down. And because this was just one more way that Parliament and the British government and all of this stuff was getting much more, I don't want to say aggressive, but definitely much more infuriating. Because we also had the Boston Massacre, keep in mind. We had a bunch of civilians who were killed by soldiers, and those soldiers were let off scot-free. We have seen in our recent days how infuriating it can be when someone in a uniform kills a civilian, the kind of person they are supposed to be protecting, and then they do not stand trial. And then they do not have any sort of consequence. So, all of this stuff was happening, and all of this overreaction from the British government, from Parliament, made the colonies say, okay, it's not enough that we do this just one at a time. We need to join together to organize a bigger and more impactful response. And this is not the first time they've done this. This is actually like the third or fourth time that they've done this. But this is the first time that it's stepping up. They're saying, look, we need to do this, we need to organize, and we need to get ready to do this again if we have to. So that's the big takeaway. The colonies are organizing against the British government and making plans to do more. So for your exit ticket, I would like you to read this little passage right here. And then as soon as you're done, take that black dot and place it over what you think the correct answer is. Same as always. So thank you all very much, and I will see you guys again with lesson 824 when we talk about the battles of the American Revolution. Have a good one.